All right. So, my name is Mary McCormick. I'm a student at Columbus State University studying computer science, and I'm here to talk to you about motivation in video games or why we play video games. So, why do we play? Well, there are a number of reasons, as video games and games in general really span a lot of different genres and mechanics. So we can play for that sense of accomplishment for finishing a game or a level or a particularly hard puzzle. We can play for the satisfaction of getting to the end of something. We can play just for the entertainment value. There are plenty of games out there that are just plain fun or the story draws us in. Or we can play for the challenge that those of us who like to play things on master mode or lunatic or veteran or whatever the hardest difficulty is on your chosen game. So now that we've covered why we play video games, let's talk about why we stop playing them or why we don't pick them up in the first place. Maybe they're boring. Maybe the premise doesn't interest us. Maybe we start playing and we just can't find a reason to keep going. Or maybe we've been playing and there's just no challenge, no real effort being put forward. We're just gliding through, and regardless of how good a story or mechanic may be, it's just not enough to keep us going if we're just breezing through challenges. So that gets us focused on the player because we have to understand where the player is coming from and what the player wants in order to design and implement what we think is going to be successful. And not everything is going to be successful for everyone, but without coming to understand these three elements, we probably aren't going to get very far anyway. So we have the story. There are a bunch of really great story-driven games out there. Games that are typically, you might call them on rails, that let you just play through a defined narrative that the developers and the writers have set out. Games like this that just come to mind would be things like The Last of Us and BioShock. And these stories, they draw us in. Then there are the achievement motivation, that being not just completing certain steps in the game, but also going out of your way to do things that are a bit more difficult or maybe even a bit weird, just to see if maybe that's going to be the thing that's going to win you a little badge and get you one step closer to getting that 100% completion rate. And then there's exploration. And this is something that, especially in recent years, as the idea and the popularity of open world games has grown, this is something that is really starting to draw players in because we have more powerful computers and more detailed graphics, and what in the past may have been just a few pixels on a map is now something incredibly beautiful and complex, and why wouldn't you want to take a look around? So with these three elements in mind, I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into each one. So when it comes to the story element in video games, I've already mentioned some stories that are on rails and how they grip the player in and really drive them and motivate them using the story. Typically, these rely on a very strict and strong connection to the characters, some sort of plot twist, or some sort of cliffhanger. I don't want to spoil anything for anyone who has not played some of these games, so I won't go into too much detail. But for example, in The Last of Us, at the start of winter, those of us who have played, we know that there's a hard shift in who you play as, and that leaves you with some questions. Or, and this is definitely going to be a spoiler, I'm sorry, but my personal favorite twist in any video game has always been "Would you kindly" from BioShock. And those are things that really
That man didn't even
turn the
try
player,
to shoot.
that just put them on edge, just get them really into the game because it's something unexpected, and especially as a late game development, it's something that's going to really get its hooks in, to really push the player to finish that last part, because it's the story has already spent all this time establishing the world and establishing the characters. To go and turn something on its head like that is really a very powerful narrative tool. So also, that's what is the point, and also why do we care? Well, the point of these games is usually set out pretty early on. You've got your general end goal of defeating the enemy or rescuing the princess. But why do we care is also such an important development to make, especially in these very heavily narrative games, because just beating the bad guy doesn't matter if you don't feel in some way personally affronted by the bad guy. And then there's also been a boom recently in games that take this idea of narrative and give it an even more in-depth twist, which almost kind of blends it into the exploration and achievement category. And those are the games like Don't Nod's Life is Strange, like the Telltale games, like David Cage's games, these games that have narrative customization, or this action will have consequences. Because not only are you engrossed by the story and the characters, but you have an active hand in what is going to happen to them based on your own choices as the player. And from a motivational standpoint, what better way to keep the player coming back than telling them that they might have missed something crucial to the story? So narrative is very important, but it's not everything. There's also the achievement. This idea that games aren't just fun because their stories are fun. A lot of games don't even have stories. You've got puzzle games and sandbox games and all of these things that just give you kind of an open view to everything and say, hey, go crazy. But it's not enough to just throw the player in the middle of a map and say, all right, have fun. You've got to give them some drive, some goal, something to work towards. So that's where, how can we be challenged, as in the players, and how can we as the developers and also the players challenge ourselves? They're things set by the developers, and they're also things set by the players. Typical achievements, the things that you get to check off on Xbox or PlayStation or whatever PC platform you use, those are set by the developers and by the writers. Not only story-based achievements, like getting achievements for completing X number of levels or for getting so far in the story, but also fun little tricks. One that immediately comes to mind is from one of my most favorite game, another one of my most favorite games, Portal 2, when you get the opportunity to take the much beloved companion cube out of the test chamber, because that's not something that you quite set out to do in the first place. You see it as a test chamber, you see it as a normal puzzle, but then you have an opportunity to take it somewhere else. And then there's also the idea of challenging ourselves as the player. And this comes from two things. One, yes, the developer set achievements where you look them up, you find out how to get them, and you think, I want to get that because I want to get as many achievements in this game as I can, or I want to get all of the achievements. So you challenge yourself by looking up predetermined goals, or maybe you challenge yourself just by doing something that you want to. One thing for me that really comes to mind is in Breath of the Wild, Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, there's a creature called a Linnell, and it's very tough, and a specific Linnell that's hiding in the Colosseum is just about the most difficult creature in the game to best. So my friends and I, of course, set the achievement for ourselves to see who could get on the Linnell and ride it the longest before it bucked us off. And so those are the things that come from the player's minds. When you set up enough variables in your game, the player's going to be able to come up with so many different ways that they can challenge themselves. And this is especially important for games that don't necessarily have an ending, where you're not trying to beat the boss, which would give you an achievement, or anything like that. Games like Harvest Moon, like Stardew Valley, like Animal Crossing, where really, yes, there are set achievements in the game, but isn't it also more fun to see how much money you can make, how many crops you can grow? Just the little things that really give the player a sense of completion that the developer may or may not have had in mind in the first place. But it's important to keep these things open, to keep this kind of achievement availability open so that the player can set as many achievements for themselves that the developer may never have thought of. And finally, this idea of exploration. And like I said, this really, really comes from the most recent boom in open world games, but that's not all. I mean, bringing achievements and exploration together, probably the earliest example of this would be finding the Easter egg in Adventure, trying to find just every little thing that you can. What can you see? The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, bringing that back again, I think is an excellent example of this, as well as the opening to Fallout 4. Both of these are major games that once the player has completed some little task in a very enclosed area, is all of a sudden shown a wide view. That's Link running to the top of the cliff at the very opening of Breath of the Wild. That's the player emerging from the vault at the very beginning of Fallout. And all of a sudden, you see everything that there is to explore, or almost everything. And that automatically sets off some bells, some little reminders that, oh, that looks cool. I want to go there, or that looks challenging. I want to go there. And then what is there to find? Because that goes beyond just what you can see, but what you can interact with, what different interactions are going to get you. Things like picking up objects and putting them in somewhere else to trigger some kind of event. Things like finding Easter eggs or finding treasure chests that you've never found before. All of these things really help motivate the player just by giving them even more free rein than just the player challenging themselves with achievements. Because this is really something where if, as a developer, you would like to make an exploration-based game, you really get to put your heart and soul into everything that the player could possibly find. And just seeing the reaction when someone does find that thing could make it very worth it. So, not all games are the same. We have story-based, achievement-based, exploration-based, and you could really break down all of those categories on different minutiae. So what's important when you're making a game is to figure out what your motivation is. When the game is over, or even when the game is in the middle of everything, what do you want the player to get out of it? Do you want them to get a feeling of accomplishment from the story? Do you want them to challenge themselves and prove that they can go beyond what they thought was impossible? Do you want them to just have a ball and go out there and explore? Do you want it to be any combination of these? And then what do you, as the developer, want to showcase? Because that is a hugely important thing to realize. If you're trying to make a story-based game and you make everything about achievements, that could work. But it's important to have your game mechanics and your idea for the game and what you want the player to get out of it. You want those ideas to align. And then what message, if any, do you want to send? Because not all games have to have messages, but a lot of them do. Take Undertale, for example, which won Game of the Year back in 2015, just because it turned the idea of that sort of RPG on its head by saying you don't have to attack, you don't have to be confrontational. Instead, you can try to make friends with everyone. So once you've figured out what you want the player motivation to be, you've got to think about these do's and don'ts. Or it's really just one do and one don't, because you could, again, split all of these up on minutia, but it really boils down to these two things. You need to remind the player why they're playing. This can be with little notifications, with phrases woven into the story that bring back the overarching plot, with just little pings on a map or something that indicate where the player is supposed to be going. And you don't want to take too long to get to the point. Especially if you really want to keep the player going. I have an example in my head, but it's a very, very obscure indie game that I honestly only put 20 minutes into because it was based on doing test chambers, kind of like Portal, but at no point did it tell you how far you were going, what your goal was. And all the tests were kind of the same, which really brings in some of the why don't we play. I got bored, it was too easy, and I had no drive to finish it. So getting to the point quickly, not too quickly necessarily, but not leaving the player hanging. That is very important when it comes to building the motivation into your video game. And that's all I have for you guys. So yeah, just to wrap it up, make sure it's fun. And make sure you know why the player is coming back. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mary. Good stuff. Do you want to go ahead and close the screen share and just go to camera?
Yes, I can do that.
All right. All right. If you have questions, please type them in chat. Beanborg says, fun, never heard of it. Simon brought up the question of Richard Bartle's 4 types of gamers: clubs, spades, diamonds, and hearts. Really, they break down to achievers, explorers. Oh, goodness, why am I blanking on it? Achievers, explorers, killers. I can't believe I am blanking on it. Socializers, that's right, sorry. Obviously, I don't like other people. So, yeah, I know, Joe, you're not seeing either of us yet. Mary's getting the camera going. So
yes, sorry about that. I had to reset my computer earlier today, so a lot of my default settings are out.
You can see her cute icon.
Okay,
There
here we
go.
go.
All right, so now we will take it so it is just Mary and not my obnoxious icon. All right. So, Mary, are you familiar with Bartle's 4 types of gamers? Have you ever heard that? Richard Bartle.
I've heard it. I've not necessarily looked into it very far. I think I heard it just in passing.
Yeah, it's great because you did recreate a fair amount of it. So Bartle only talking about players in his the old MUDs, the old multi-user dungeons, would talk about four types: the achievers, the explorers, the socializers, and the killers. Basically, the trolls who tried to ruin everybody else's time in the game. Yeah, yeah, you know that motivation. Uh, and you've gone a little bit deeper than he would go into talking about the different achievements that they're interested and so forth. But one of the fascinating things that Bartle always stressed is that nobody is one type of a player. That everybody's a mix of these, and which one's dominant changes at different times. How would you see these mixing for a game developer who's trying to keep a player motivated along the way? How should they reach out to these different aspects of us in the game?
Well, certainly, I don't think there are really any games out there that are solely focusing on one type of player. So when it comes to developers making games, I think it's important to have an idea in your head of what you want the primary motivation to be, whether it's achieving, exploring, the socializing, or the story element. I mean, I would hope nobody goes into a game solely wanting to be a killer, but I know they exist. But figuring out what your main motivation is that you want to set, and then trying to interweave the other types of motivation so that you can really appeal to most people.
All right. And certainly some games will not try to appeal to everybody, right, Joe? I'd ask Joe what he tried to get across when he was doing it, and his point was to have fun, which of course is a pretty broad term. He says he works to get them in the game quickly. Then he shows them variety, and I talk to them mostly. So yeah, it's very interesting how Joe motivates his players along the way. Definitely a lot of achievers in his game, but I don't think Joe would say that most of them are focused on being achievers. Uh, he will often talk about how they're into it for being distracted. So I'll let Joe raise the point of what kind of gamers they are. X Cosmic Arts X asked if some of this would go under UX, user experience research, and and player profiling personal. Personas. Sorry, not personal. Sorry, I'm too low rev. So would a lot of this achievements, would you handle this through the user experience design? Would you create player profiles, specific personas for them, i.e., Joe is a regular player of my game. He's going to be a 21-year-old male who likes the combat part but not the crafting. Would you structure it like that?
I'm not sure if I would personally, but then I can be very single minded when it comes to my own designs. I think that that is definitely an a very useful way of designing games, trying to think about who all could potentially pick up your game and trying to generate these personas in order to figure out how each person, what is going to appeal to them the most.
Excellent. All right, Ring Tuple says, if you like story slash premise, I will go for all the achievements in the game. For instance, what he did in LA Noire. Yeah, a lot of us are achievement junkies, trying to get all of them. Mary, one topic you brought up was that you don't want to get too long to give the player what their goal is, what their achievement should be, what will matter to them in the game. Uh, there is a classic curve in game design which says that as the players get more experience, the game difficulty should go up in tandem with it. So if the game is getting more difficult than the player's skill, they get frustrated and leave the game. On the other hand, if it's too easy and it's easier in their skill, they will get bored and leave the game. Do you see this also being true for what they're trying to accomplish? That what they should be accomplishing, what should matter to them as players, should increase as the game continues?
You mean in terms of story?
Sure, yeah.
I mean, definitely. And that also goes on just with, especially in story games, exposure to the characters. you've got to, when you design your game, really kind of increase the stakes as you go along. Um, I know I brought it up earlier in the talk, but I think a really good example of this is the way that The Last of Us sets up the first part of the game, where you're just trying to get Ellie out of the city, versus once you find out what's really going on, the stakes have suddenly increased a lot. And you've already invested a lot of emotion into these characters, or at least some emotion, and then it suddenly really takes everything into a hard gear shift. Everything changes. Your view of a lot of the characters ends up changing, and that also helps to raise the stakes. So definitely, you've got to, as the game goes on, specifically for very story-based games, you've got to really raise the stakes in order to keep the players involved.
Sure, and you also meet more characters that you care about if it's written well, and hopefully care about the world more. I would have loved to continue this conversation longer, but we got started late. So I tell you what, folks. Mary, can you get into the Twitch chat and tell folks how they can reach you if they have other questions or want to discuss what you presented here? If you don't feel like sharing a specific email or something, if you want to give your Discord name, something like that, some sort of public uh, identity, you don't mind being out there on the net. And Simon, we'll go ahead and switch over to you. Thank you very much, Mary. Great stuff. And we will go ahead and get Simon in here in 2 minutes.